the best way to be prepared to make those right judgments in the moment is to develop as many virtues as possible, as strongly as possible. Because part of a virtue is recognizing where it applies.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Manning. I'm an adjunct formator here at St. John's Seminary in Brighton. Delighted to be spending some time with you today, along with Father Denis Nakkeeran and Dr. Pete Kilner. Today, over the course of the next hour or so, we hope to explore together two mutually supporting yet distinct concepts related to leadership. First and foremost, we want to talk about character, what it is, why it's important, and how we can build character within ourselves and others. And then we'd also like to explore this idea of moral injury when there's been a violation of a known ethical or moral standard. With that, I want to turn it over to Pete to introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Pete Kilner. I'm very happy and honored to be here with you today. I served 40 years in the U.S. Army as an enlisted soldier, West Point cadet, Army infantry officer, and then West Point Academy professor in the military, where I focused on military ethics. And then after I retired from uniform, I was a civilian professor where I was the chair for character development at the academy, where I designed and implemented the character education program. Over the course of my career, my areas of interest and somewhat expertise are military ethics, moral injury, and character development.
Fantastic. Dr. Kilner, it's great for you to join us here. For our listeners, this is Father Denis Nakkeeran, professor of moral theology here at St. John's, part of the external formation team. We're just excited to have this conversation today. And so to kick it off, we're going to just begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for every good gift that you give us. We thank you for the gift of ourselves, the ways in which you're calling us to grow, for the gift of virtue that you give us, and the call to grow in virtue, to develop good and holy character, and what that means in our way of following you, in our road of discipleship, and how we can grow to be the most excellent people as you have created us to be. Please guide our conversation and help us to know how we are to carry out your will. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Father Denis, thank you. So, Father and everyone, before we get started here, I just wanted to share a quick story about Pete, and not to embarrass him. It's a great story, and I think one that, Father, I know you'll appreciate as well as our listeners. Leadership is storytelling. So I knew of Pete Kilner, knew Pete by reputation over the course of maybe the last 5 to 10 years, the work that he's done up at West Point, the United States Military Academy, the country's greatest leadership lab. And I knew of Pete and as a member of the faculty, the work that he was doing on character development, organizational leadership, and some other things. Where our paths crossed, though, it was somewhat recently, like within the last, I'd say 6 months to a year. And Pete and I had connected on LinkedIn, right? That's the only social media platform I have. And we had connected on LinkedIn. But we quickly were able to discern that there were a couple really neat connections. And so, Father, I think as you're aware, and I may have shared previously in this forum, I'm a Providence College grad, and I also had an opportunity to come back and, while wearing the uniform, to serve as an assistant professor of military science there. And while I was at PC, back circa 2003, 2004 timeframe, one of our cadets was Joe Kilner. And Joe Kilner was Pete's nephew. So that was a neat connection that we were able to establish pretty early on. But what I wanted to share with you, Father, and really for the purposes of the conversation we're going to have today, is this next story. And so, same time frame, 2003, 2004, when I'm at Providence College, and working with the cadets that were matriculating through PC and some other schools as members of the ROTC battalion, and ultimately pursuing a commission in the Army as officers. And one of our cadets who ultimately commissioned, great young man who went out into the Army and had to do some hard things, had to do some really, really hard things. And war demands that of an individual, some of us more than others, just given the circumstances that we may find ourselves in. At any rate, there was a book that was written about an experience that a unit had in Iraq, and this particular young man, he figures somewhat prominently in this story. He's a great man, and he struggled pretty greatly related to some of his experiences in combat. And so the next Pete Kilner connection, which I think really speaks to who he is and what taking care of people looks like, is that Pete, through some connections, was able to identify this particular former cadet of ours and a couple other members of this unit that figure, again, somewhat prominently in this book. I actually asked them to come up a number of years back to West Point to tell their story. And it afforded them with an opportunity to talk to cadets at West Point that were, maybe a handful of years behind these folks, but were going to be Army officers themselves. And it was an opportunity for them to share their leadership stories, what they did well, what they did poorly. But also part of this, and this is what I think, Pete was really driving at, it was an opportunity for these individuals that had been wounded by virtue of having to make some decisions that they didn't always get them right, and in some circumstances, being compelled to violate a known ethical or moral standard, right? And we can really hurt ourselves. And Pete Kilner, again, by virtue of bringing these folks up and in some cases inviting them into his home, really encouraged rehabilitation among some of these folks as they were, just beginning this journey of healing. And so that's who this man is, and I just wanted to share that, not to embarrass you, Pete, but that really impacted me when you and I connected and you shared that with me. So I want you to know that. So again, we're going to talk about character today. We're going to talk about what it is, why it matters, how we can build it, and then we'll, time permitting, we're going to talk about moral injury. So, Pete, I want to start with you. Could you get us started? What is character, and why should we care about it?
So that's a big question, because character is a very big concept, but I think it can be summarized as our character. Any person's character is their reliability to do what is good and admirable in any situation, to do the right thing at the right time, for the right reasons, with the right motivations. Character is this product of having good values of who you want to be, good habits so that you actually live that out, and good judgment, because we can all support the same good universal principles, but life is lived in specific details, where, what does it mean to be loving to this person at this time, especially when virtues can conflict, right? Because there could be a time where, a story from the Army is if a soldier who died was wounded, people couldn't get to him. And so his last, 40 minutes was calling for help, calling out to his mother, and they couldn't get to him. So the soldiers felt terrible about that, his fellow soldiers. When they came back after the deployment, the deceased soldier's parents came, and they wanted to meet the unit. They wanted to talk to the people who were with him. And they asked, well, how did he die? So, is that the time for absolute honesty? What role does compassion play? There's a time and a place for different things. And so, you don't want to lie, but you want to be compassionate. There'll be other times when, we want to be there for people, but we also have our job that we have to get done, right? There's how much justice, how much mercy in situations. And so character involves those kind of judgments. But the only way to be the person who can make those judgments is to build up within ourselves the building blocks of character, which are the virtues, things like honesty and generosity and stewardship and creativity and resilience. So by building up all of these individual virtues, then when we face situations, we kind of know, we're more likely to know the right mix to apply them so that we're able to do that good and admirable thing in real life.
That's awesome. Thanks for getting us started. Father Dennis, your thoughts?
That sounds amazing. Obviously, we want to be able to be those people that can make those correct choices in those situations when they come up. And that's difficult because we can't anticipate every possible situation that we're going to face. We can't possibly figure out what exactly we want to do in everything. We can have great ideas and we can have these ideals that we want to strive for, but to actually do them and to have such a stable disposition to actually do it when the time arises, that is extremely, extremely difficult. But the way that you mapped it out is so critical for us to understand. And, Thomas Aquinas will say almost the exact same thing, using more scholastic language. People often would accuse Aquinas of being way too systematic of his approach in looking at the human person and almost breaking it down too mechanically. And I could see the argument for that, but I mean, when rubber meets the road, he gets it right in many, many cases. And this is exactly where he says we got to start somewhere, right? And we got to end somewhere. And that whole journey is where the whole second part of the Summa Theologiae really comes into play. Right, we have our end goal in mind is we want to get to heaven. Right? And that's how he contextualizes everything. Right, our goal is to be in union with God. And so how do we get there? How do we actually get there? It starts with our moral choices. And that comes from, okay, I want to do the right thing. There's the ideal, learning the right things to do, and then building up those habits, that virtue that helps me to do the things when the time calls for it. Of course, in practice, that's a lot more difficult than it sounds, but that's the basic building block of the entire moral life. And it's not just about the doing, right? But it's about being that person that can do those things, right? And the primacy there is about the person that you are rather than the things that you do. The things that you do are important, but that's a consequence of who you are. And I think that's a huge thing for us to understand.
Yeah, that's great, Father. Thank you. I want to come back to, Pete shared a story with us, and and it was a very raw and a really dramatic event a number of years ago. And I'd like to use again another story that I think can maybe help us unpack. And I do want to get at the example that Pete shared with us is, how do you reconcile, two conflicting, values or virtues, right? And so I'm at the airport a number of years ago. I'm getting ready to travel on one of my many, many trips. And it was here locally. And I was flying out of TF Green Airport. And there were some Dominicans. They were in the waiting area. And one was a Dominican priest. And he was communicating with with another passenger. Okay, it was just another civilian. And I'm listening. Frankly, I'm eavesdropping, but it's a good conversation. And he's sharing with this civilian that he had recently been approached. This is a young Dominican padre by a Dominican nun that was teaching at one of the local schools. So adjacent to Providence College, there is a Catholic school called St. Pius. Okay, there's a church there, and there's a Catholic grade school. And so this Catholic nun had approached this particular Dominican father and said, "Father, how should we respond to one of our students that approaches us and asks, 'Is Santa Claus real?'" And what he shared, I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version here, and it was a great conversation. And I was a father with younger children at the time. But Father responded to this query from the nun by saying, well, you have to tell the truth. You have to always tell the truth. And so in this case, he was suggesting to this nun that if a young student, could be in the first or second grade, right, innocently asks, "Hey, sister, is Santa Claus real?" His response to her was, "Yes, you need to." And she pushed back. Sister pushed back. And so maybe kind of pulling forward, Pete, the example that you shared a few moments ago of, compassion, wanting to defend the innocence of this young student. But how do we, I'm giving you this rote example of, these different virtues in conflict. How do we do that? How do you give primacy to one over another? Does the situation or the context demand that we weigh one virtue over another? Do you want to jump on that, Pete, first?
Sure. I think it's very interesting, the Santa Claus example, because he was very well developed in terms of his appreciation for honesty, and it's a critical, probably the foundational virtue, but maybe short on the understanding of how we help and support families and children's dreams and things like that. And so what that example points out to me is that the best way to be prepared to make those right judgments in the moment is to develop as many virtues as possible, as strongly as possible. Because part of a virtue is recognizing where it applies. So often in life, when I have not shown the compassion I should have in a situation, I honestly didn't even notice the problem. And so I've learned my wife has helped me. I need to notice more of these kind of things. And so part of a virtue is noticing where it applies, right? And then knowing what kind of how to apply that virtue, and having developed the habits to really understand it and to do it the right way. So I think character in some ways is like health, right? The best way not to have a heart attack at 50 is not to smoke at 20 and to work out, right? So things develop over time. It's like our physical fitness, right? Where we get stronger if we practice things over time. And so I think the best way to make the judgment is to say every day, even on the simple things, I'm going to try to do the right thing. I'm going to try to notice in every situation how I can actualize being the best person I can be here, because over time we'll get reps at noticing things and reps at doing things when they're easy, and then doing things, choosing the harder right over the easy or wrong. And all of that is really preparing ourselves so that when we have situations that feel like dilemmas, where there is just no easy right answer, that we can make the best decision. And very importantly for others, once people know and trust that we really care about others, that we really try to do the right thing, they'll accept our judgment in that situation rather than second guess.
Thank you, Pete. Padre.
Yeah, but when it comes to the Santa Claus question, that's a very, very interesting one, because, at the end of the day, well, depending on the age of our listeners, hopefully we don't take off the Band-Aid here, but when we're talking about Santa Claus, you don't want to be the one to break that child's heart, right? You don't want to be the one to do that. maybe they'll discover it at some point, but you really don't want to be that guy that does it. My response that I've used in the past when asked if Santa Claus was real, I said something to the effect of, "Oh, you mean Saint Nick? Yeah, of course Saint Nick is real. We love Saint Nicholas, right?" That kind of you're kind of skirting it a little bit. You're shifting the question or shifting the frame a little bit so that you don't have to lie. And I think that's an important thing, because when it comes to virtue, yes, everything must be contextualized and specified to the scenario. And right, Aquinas will say, when it comes to prudence, right? Prudence, he calls the charioteer of all the virtues, because it's prudence that's going to drive the action in the specific context, and recognizing that different actions might be required in different situations. And so if a kid asks, is Santa Claus real? Yes, honesty is a chief virtue, right? Because to lie means to be against the truth, and you never want to be against the truth. But there's a way for you to not lie and still not answer the question. And so, we might be able to find a way to do that. People bring up the often used situation of, okay, let's say you're in 1930s Germany and you're hiding some Jewish friends in your basement. Nazis knock on your door and ask if you're hiding someone. What do you do in that situation? Right? You're not going to rat out your friends. You're not going to say, "Oh yeah, they're hiding in my basement." You would use whatever methods of pseudo deception, right? Maybe masking some element while not outright lying. And that could be a valid technique. Right? That's not saying that everything is situational. We're not saying that. We want to avoid a casuistry in which we say that there are no moral principles to be applied. There are. But those moral principles are applied in the specific. And so in that case, you would be able to say, have a look around. I have nothing to hide. Right? You're not saying that there's no one there, but at the same time, you're also not leading any suspicion that there might be someone based on your answer. And if you've hidden them well, then hopefully they won't be found out, or something to that effect. Because when we tell the truth, we don't have to say everything. We can give limited pieces of information and still hold to the truth. I just think back, right? One of the classic sitcom examples of this is, right, someone is putting on a new outfit and, does this make me look fat? You don't want to say yes. You also don't necessarily want to just completely ignore the situation. And so you'd say, you look great. Right? Avoiding the specifics while still getting to the heart of the matter. And so when it comes to these things in conflict, we got to know just how to take it into context, right? How to take it in that specific context.
Yeah, and part of the context is the person, like, do I look fat? If you know the people, some people really want to know the answer, right? Because they don't want to go out if they're looking particularly unattractive. And for some people, they're actually searching for a compliment, right? And so that's why that the context, the particularities really matter. It's just important. You never want to disregard what is right. I can say after my years at West Point, I have lied. I think I remember every time I have. But I really appreciate that after 4 years under the honor code, I never lied without knowing it and without making a conscious decision. Because earlier in life, I think I lied without even being bothered by it, right? And so there are some times where you have to say, I'm choosing a greater, and it needs to be for some greater good in this situation. And we have to be careful with that, and that's why if we're going to trust people with judgment, character is so important. If we're not going to trust people, we're all going to have to live by these broad sets of rules that too often do not take into account the really morally significant local situations of people, right? And so we don't want to be trapped. God didn't make us just to live straight by rules. He gave us the capacity to exercise judgment, and we need to make the most of that capacity, right? By developing our character. I love the idea that, God created each of us differently with different strengths and weaknesses. Character is making the most of what we have. You gave me this raw IQ, but I can practice and develop my creativity, my curiosity, my critical thinking skills, my ability to see things from multiple perspectives. I can learn and practice and do that to make the most of what I've been given. And I think that's, it's the parable of the talents, right? That's what we should do. Be thankful to God for what we've been given. Our character is the part of us that we can control to make the most of that.
It's beautiful. Father, I want to come back to you here. And again, I want to pull forward something that Pete just shared. So he made reference to the honor code. So not only did Pete teach at West Point in a couple different capacities, but he was also first and foremost a student there. And motto is a cadet shall not lie, cheat, or steal, right?
Or tolerate those
those who do. So, Father Denis, can you talk to us a little bit about what is the role of the power of habitus, okay? And let's talk a little bit about maybe, familial, team, organizational habitus in forming good character.
Yeah. Habitus is a very important thing for us to understand, and especially in the realm of our moral life. Right? Aquinas will say that habit is the foundation of our character. It's a foundation for everything that we do. Because let's look at the whole picture. A broken clock is right twice a day, right? So just because I could do the right thing every once in a while doesn't mean that I am fundamentally someone who does good things, right? I could be someone who is a notorious thief, but maybe once in a while I might have sent something to someone, right, to help them out, right? Or I could be just some expert in some sort of criminal activity, but I can use that for some seemingly good purpose. But that doesn't necessarily make me a virtuous person. And so habitus is that stable disposition to do something, right? And that's the way by which we operate in almost every capacity. There is some sense of a stability there. And stability means that it's going to withstand any weathering that comes by and is still able to do what it's supposed to do when you need to do it, right? I am not particularly athletic, right? I might be able to go up on a basketball court and, maybe once in a while I'll get lucky and land a basket. I'll land a shot. Oh, fantastic, right? But that's not something that I'd be able to repeat with great fidelity. That's not something I'll be able to just do repeatedly. Right? That was a fluke for me. But a professional athlete, a professional basketball player, you get him on the court and he is shooting consistently. Right? That's because he has a stable disposition to do what he does well. And so that's what Aquinas really gets to with that sense of habitus, right? Is that it is something stable in which someone could do something easily, they could do it excellently, and they could do it joyfully. Right? That means I know what I can do, and I'll do it. Right? And he says that's the foundation for virtue, because we can build up all sorts of habits, good habits, bad habits, right? But what he calls virtue is that habitus, that stable disposition to do what is truly good. And as we've talked about on this podcast before, right, the four chief cardinal virtues, right, of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, right? Those are all things that are oriented towards the good, but there's a stability there. Right? And so habitus is the way that we form that. So how do we get to that place of stability? The only way we can form something stable is by doing it. Right? Aquinas will say it's repeated action that forms a habit. Right? So the only way for me to grow in prudence and to develop a habit of prudence is to do prudent things. The only way for me to be someone that can consistently shoot 3-pointers is for me to actually just keep doing it. And that's why athletes practice, right? Is to develop that habitus. It's to develop that stable disposition so they can perform when they need to without even thinking about it. And for us in the moral life, right, that's what we want, is to be able to not have to think about it, right? Where it comes almost automatically, this sense of, I want to do good. I want to be good, and I want to actually express the goodness of who I am and who God created me to be. And right, that's where it starts, right? Is creating that stable disposition.
You made me think, some of my students, when I taught Aristotelian virtue ethics, before we started that block, I would have, one of their assignments was, think about the best person you know, just the best human being you know. Write that person's name, and you have to know them personally. Now think why out of the thousands of people you know they came to mind. Describe them, their traits. And then what do you know about how they became that way? And it really set up the best people they know they had about the same list of 12 virtues. They were all honest, hardworking, kind, all these things. So they all seem to have this same list of virtues. And when they would brief, then I would have them brief about their person. Time and again, they said, this person's just naturally this way. They're naturally generous. They love helping people. They love hard work, whatever it is. They love solving hard problems. And I would have the chance to point out to them, actually, no one is naturally that way. They have become that way by repeatedly doing it, where it becomes something they don't even have to think about, and in fact have learned to love it. That's how they see themselves. I am a virtuous person, and so I'm happiest when I'm behaving virtuously.
That's great. Father, how do you reconcile within yourself, or what would you recommend, to us seated around the table here, those that are listening to this podcast? In my own lived experience, there have been a number of instances where I was part of an organization where there were leaders that were deliberately choosing to not live our organizational values, right? The way that they were charged to do so. So they were not leading themselves or others virtuously, right? And so over time, in some of the more acute circumstances, that became part of organizational habitus, right? Was that, hey, this is how we do business around here. And it was rotten. So if you find yourself in that organization, or in an organization like that, or a circumstance like that, and whether you're, in a formal leadership position, or you may just be, a member of the team and a valued member of the team contributing to, that the organization's desired future state. But what options do you have, right? What are you compelled to do? You want to lead and live your values virtuously. But what recourse do you have in that circumstance?
That's an excellent question. In those circumstances, well, at the end of the day, we still have our reason and our free will. Right? No matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, we will always have our reason and our free will, which means we always have the capacity to do something. Now, our full ability to do something can vary depending on the circumstances, our place in the organization, right? What ability we have to affect one thing or another. But when it comes to this kind of situation, which you're finding your group or organization is not living up to, right, what it's supposed to, it's being less than virtuous in some regard. One, you still have the capacity to be virtuous. Right? That doesn't change even if the organization is lacking in something there. You still have the capacity to do something. And depending on the particular context, that could also influence the rest of the organization to grow in that particular virtue. Now, the way that interaction might look is going to vary dependently, right? Some might be able to be more outspoken. on something like that, be a more direct witness to it, or it could be far more subtle, and people can pick up on the difference just in one's individual virtue as opposed to what's different with the organization. But that ability is always there, because in forming these habits, we also have to understand that our actions shape us, right? There is something important to understand about the fact that, yes, our actions have an effect on us. Right? That's the whole reason we can grow in virtue, because our good actions are giving good shape to our soul. And similarly, right, bad actions are going to give bad shape to our soul. Right? So the more I do good things, the more I'm going to grow in virtue. Right? The more bad things I do, the more I'm going to grow in vice. Right? Or the way it's going to detract from my good virtue, the way it's going to help offset my vices, right? All this interplay, just how that affects us individually also can affect a collective group, right? The actions are going to help shape what that is. And so if you're experiencing, okay, there's this aspect of this organization that I don't like, call it corruption, call it whatever thing you might be experiencing in particular, you can help shape that, right, by your own individual character. Because at the end of the day, everyone can recognize an incongruity. Right? When there is something that is lacking, they can pick up on it, and that could hopefully move them to greater action. But you can't guarantee that, right? What you can guarantee is what you can do.
Yeah, I think he explained that very well. The only thing perhaps I can add is, at some point we have to decide, do I remain in the organization and shape things as best I can, or is there a time to say I'm no longer willing to be a part of this organization because I'm implicating myself? But in either case, I think the goal should be, how do I help myself be the person I'm supposed to be, and how do I help the organization thrive in the way it should be? And that should be the goal, not a selfish thing of worrying about my career. It should always be, how can I act in a way that supports the good?
That's awesome. So, gentlemen, for the remaining time that we have together, I want to pivot to the second of the two concepts that we wanted to cover today. And this next concept is titled moral injury, right? And again, it really is related very, very closely to character. And Father Denis, just for context, Pete and I we had an opportunity to chat through this a little bit earlier today, and there's a name that I want to share here as we tee this up. So there was a psychiatrist, Harvard-trained, a Bostonian, actually grew up in the western part of the state, by the name of Jonathan Shea. And Dr. Shea is largely recognized as having introduced into into our the lexicon this idea, the concept of moral injury. And he worked at the VA, literally right down the road from here in Boston, for a decade and a half. And he was working with soldiers and Marines, most of whom had seen very, very heavy ground combat in Vietnam. And so he was dealing with folks that had, a number of different, ailments as related to their service. Certainly post-traumatic stress disorder. But what he came to notice through a lot of these interviews with these soldiers that had seen combat over time and space was that many of them were wounded, and there wasn't a physical wound or malady, but rather there was this wound to their moral self. And more times than not, it was directly caused by this particular veteran observing or hearing about a violation of a known ethical or moral standard on the part of a leader. And again, for many, many years, it was kind of buried under the auspices of post-traumatic stress disorder. but it's something distinctly different, right? And again, we're talking about moral injury. Moral injury absolutely happens in the military, but it happens in every vocation, in every domain, to include the church. And so I guess, Father, and this is a difficult question, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless because we need to. It's important, I think, to hear your thoughts and Pete's as well. But how can we develop, maybe a two-part question, how can we develop those moral injury kind of resistance factors, and then within an organization where a moral injury has taken place, how can we heal?
That is a loaded question, and it's not something we can treat in such a short period of time fully. But when it comes to that sense of moral injury, first to address the question of how we can kind of stave that off, it comes purely from a sense of security, like having a good sense of security in yourself, having a stability of understanding your character and your standing. And when we put this into a Catholic context, a security in your relationship with the Lord, and a security in understanding who you are in relation to God. That can only do so much. Obviously, a stability, we want to be able to weather these kinds of storms, but we're not impervious. We're not going to be completely impervious to these moral injuries from wherever they come. And the worst thing about a moral injury is that it not only, right, some things might affect us physically, we can heal. Even emotionally, we can heal. But the healing is far more difficult and significant when it gets to the heart of who we are. Because that's going to create a very significant wound. There are many ways in which we can get wounded, but a moral injury, I believe the document is called Dolores Salvifici from John Paul II, in which he talks about there are two types of suffering that we can experience, right? Physical suffering and moral suffering. Right? And he says the physical suffering, we can find help with that. Right? It's still not good to go through, but we can find help. It is much more difficult to find help with moral suffering. Because it's with moral suffering that we have this existential pain. Right? That something is fundamentally off, and it affects our entire worldview and the entire way in which we relate to people. And so when we suffer a moral injury, it's going to affect every aspect of our life. Right? Every way in which we relate to people. Our whole image of who God is and who we are could be destroyed because of that. Right? The way that we perceive ourselves, right? The lies we start to believe about ourselves, right? The lies we start to believe about other people. Right? And then ultimately what does that lead is to vows that we take in our life that can lead us in the wrong direction. Right? For instance, right, if it comes from a place of leadership, right, there's a moral injury that's inflicted upon me because that was not an adequate leader, and he or she might have belittled me to a significant extent, for example. Right? What does the lie that can result from that? That I am not good, that I am insignificant, I will never measure up. Right? That is a moral injury that is sustained because of that. And what is that going to do in terms of that person? It's going to destroy their whole perception of authority. That could be projected onto God, and seeing God as someone who's going to belittle them because God is someone of supreme authority. And so what is the vow that could be created as a result of that? Because we all do this, right? Every internal thing that we experience will lead to a way that we act, and that comes through our vows. And so the vow that we might create, if someone has belittled us and we feel insignificant, we feel like absolute dirt because of that, I am never going to trust authority again. I am never going to act in a way that's going to make me feel belittled, or I must be the best. I have to be the one in charge. We see all these ways in which the perception of authority can be warped. Right? And so what does this do? This distorts our perception of reality. Right? We can still operate in some way, but our whole sense of reality, our whole sense of who we are, of who God is, has been now fundamentally disrupted and wounded. And so there has to be a healing that comes into that for us to experience the fullness of truth and reality. Because God wants us to experience his blessedness. But when some avenue has been destroyed or ruptured, again, healing needs to be brought there. And that's a lifelong process of healing. We can't just get there in a day. It is a whole process of coming into a sense of, okay, where is that wound? What's the source of that wound? Bringing God into that, allowing Jesus to be the one to actually heal that wound so that that channel can be fixed. But that's not something we can do exclusively on our own. That requires the grace of God, right? Because we're dealing with something that is so internal, right? We can't reach that alone. It needs to be guided in love, right? Hopefully through the intervention of a friend, possibly a psychologist, right? At the very least, someone who can love us and then introduce us to the love of God, which is going to be the only thing that heals. I know I threw a lot into that right at once, but I think there are a couple things we might be able to unpack from that.
Pete, I'm going to hand the baton to you here in just a moment. One thing I wanted to just share, Father, is you and Pete, as you were speaking, and we've all been morally injured, right? All of us. And I'll speak for myself. I know I have, and I'm absolutely not proud of this. There's great shame associated with causing a moral injury, and they happen in our personal lives. They happen in our professional lives, right? One way, Father, that I will share, and you, I think you spoke to this very beautifully, but in my own lived experience, working through the hardest times in my life, and a very holy priest down in Rhode Island, retired Marine by the name of Tom Woodhouse, and he said, Michael, you need to go sit with the true presence. You need to get to adoration. And I found in my own life, spending time with Jesus that way, right? It was through communing with Jesus that way. That's where the healing took place. That's an act of surrender, right? It's an act of surrender. It's an act of just being. So thank you for that, Father. Pete, your thoughts on anything you heard?
Yes, moral injury presupposes this innate God-given sense of justice and right and wrong. And so that when an authority figure violates our sense of what's right, it hurts us so much. That authority figure, Jonathan Shea talked about commanders in war. Commanders telling them to shoot into a village that was full of civilians. That was one of the examples from the book. And how that person feels such shame and such anger because they took an oath to follow orders, but not orders like that. So they felt betrayed and they did something bad as a result. It can be our parents. That's why our parents are so impactful. They're an authority figure in our lives. If they don't lead us the right way, it can be devastating for children. To some extent, because we are moral agents, we have authority over ourselves. So in war, if you lose your cool and you lash out at a non-combatant because your buddy was just killed, you have betrayed yourself because that is not who you want to be. And there is also a sense, now again, I only study war and soldiers, of feeling being betrayed by God. That I became a soldier to be the good guy, to do good things. I'm put in these impossible situations. Or why did this weather cause this? The mystery of evil, the problem of evil, is so apparent on the battlefield. And most Americans never encounter it here. Thank God. But when they get there, they have to pass by suffering children because the mission has to go on. And it wounds them terribly. So it's, in all these cases, it's this idea of authority and being disappointed or feeling betrayed. And that includes betraying ourselves or the sense of God betraying us. I found a lot of it in terms of helping people address it. And again, with soldiers, one of the most important things is that they can talk it out. Because sometimes things are really crazy in our imaginations, and when we talk it out, we make it explicit and we hear it, somehow we gain control over it, And then other people can help us reframe it. And we see that someone else who was there, or someone else who understands it, says, no, like, you didn't do that. Or given this situation, the information that you had at hand, that's all you could do. And so it's my personal interest is, how do we help develop people's sense of characters and strength of character so that they're more likely not to listen to a boss who tells them to do something wrong, more likely to maintain their composure and to do what's right even when it's really hard and every part of their passion is telling them to do the wrong thing, but they still hold on and do what's right. That's temperance, right? And then even if they do something wrong, to almost recognize, like, that struggle for developing good character is this constant battle of, I'm a human being. Like, we're never perfect. We always know we're just trying to get better. And so I think having a good, well-developed sense of one of my most important projects is nurturing and cultivating my own character, almost comes with it the sense that, yes, and sometimes we're probably going to fail. Get back up, pick up, and start moving in the right direction again. Now, if you're Catholic, it's great to have confession, right? That can help. I worked with a Protestant chaplain. He had been a Catholic growing up, and when his combat brigade came back, he did like a baptismal ceremony. He didn't call it that, but he washed each soldier's head, poured water over him, and said, you did what our country asked you to do. You did your duty, and as long as you did your best to do the right thing, however it turned out, I absolve you. And some soldiers thought that was weird. Some soldiers were crying and thought it was incredibly powerful. It was great that Catholics had even probably more authentic or authoritative means to deal with that. But so there's, I think, talking it out and even having someone, that was an expression of understanding that, hey, soldiers, you didn't start the war. You don't have the right to end the war. You did your best to protect your fellow citizens and your buddies. And war puts you in these terrible situations. We understand you are still a good person. And when I talk with people who struggle with moral injury, I try to assure them, you would not have these awful feelings if you weren't a good person. Sociopaths don't suffer from moral injury. Morally sensitive people do. And so this belief that I'm not a good person is just an absolute lie, coming from the devil. And so other people can tell you, no, in fact, you are a good person, and let's help you understand that and get you back on that path.
Yeah, that was great. Just one thing to add there, two quick pieces. So something that you mentioned, Pete, that certainly resonated and brought out this, I'm just remembering from my own lived experience in the military, something we learned from the Brits, after a particularly tough mission set, the Brits, and this is among all their different units, especially, their more highly trained, special-oriented units, but they will sit around and they'll drink a beer with each other. And it's an opportunity to just be vulnerable, to be raw, and to just let these emotions out. It's this idea of community, right? And this idea, you mentioned the word understanding. I understand. I get you. So there's this validation that's kind of baked in. The other part that I wanted to share, and to your comments of a little bit earlier, these are huge topics, so we will have to revisit these, but I think we did a pretty good job. You, Father, Pete, did a beautiful job getting us started here. But this idea of forgiveness, right? So it's, I forgive myself. I want to receive forgiveness from others, but ultimately from God the Father. And we use and teach a framework in my civilian capacity with our students. It's called the 5 Faces of Trust. I may have told you about it previously, Father, but it's using these 5 Borromean rings. And so on the outer rings, trust, you have ability, you have reliability, you have benevolence, you have integrity. And then in the middle, okay, if those 4 outer rings create trust, right, they enable, but it's forgiveness that sustains trust. And we have to forgive ourselves, and we have to be willing to forgive others. We have to be willing to receive forgiveness from others. And so with that, I think this is a great place, good inflection point to stop. I want to thank Dr. Pete Kilner for joining us, making us better today. Father Dennis, thank you to you always for your wisdom. And maybe, Father Dennis, can you get us closed out with a prayer?
Love to. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Jesus, we thank you for calling us to yourself. We thank you for the goodness with which you made us. We know that we can go astray. Things can happen to us that break that beautiful image that you have created in us. We know, Lord, that you want to restore all these things. You want to make all these things new, and this is why you came into the world, to reconcile everything to yourself, to recapitulate all of creation, to help us understand who we are in relation to you. So help us to live in this new life of grace, to live in excellence, to grow in this sense of character, to who you created us to be, so that we can be those saints that you have called us to be, and we can be with you in glory in heaven. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.